Identification, both of you. Now, you walked in here with sunglasses on in a rainstorm and dropped a badge before saying hello. That how this works now? This is a federal immigration inquiry. Produce identification. Immigration in Savannah on 2 men eating lunch?
Last warning, identification.
You sure you want to do this without asking a single question first?
The badge hit the table before anyone said a word. It landed face up. Gold. Federal seal pressed into the center. It sat right there between 2 bowls of chili, in the middle of a red vinyl booth, in the back of a narrow Savannah diner where the rain was coming down so hard outside that the front windows had fogged over completely. And the 2 men who had just walked through that door, tactical vests, dark jackets, sunglasses still on, stood there and stared at it like it was a bad joke someone forgot to make funny. The taller of the 2 agents crossed his arms. He looked at the badge. He looked at the man who had put it there, a broad-shouldered man in a forest green hoodie named Ezekiel Drummond, who was sitting perfectly still with both hands flat on the table and his eyes holding a calm so absolute it almost read as threat. Then the agent looked at the man across from Ezekiel. Tobias Osei, denim jacket, collar up, a paper napkin still in one hand from the moment they'd been interrupted mid-bite. Tobias wasn't still. He was watching the agents the way a man watches traffic he's already calculated. Identification, the agent said, not a question. A command issued to 2 men he had already decided were not the kind of people who required explanation. Ezekiel did not speak immediately. He let the word hang in the steam rising off the chili. Then he said quietly, "You're looking at it. If you're just joining us, welcome. Take a breath. This story is going to take you somewhere important. Stay with it all the way through, because what happens next changes everything." The agent's name was Ron Baxter, 12 years with Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And he had a reputation in his unit for working fast, for not asking too many questions before he moved. His partner, a younger agent named Craig Merlot, stood near the aisle, positioned so that leaving the booth meant going through him. They had walked into this diner on a rainy Thursday morning with no warrant, no active operation, and no record of any enforcement activity filed for this county that day. They had walked in because the 2 men in this booth had, in Baxter's word, fit. What that word meant, what it had always meant in the way Baxter used it, was something a federal jury would spend 4 hours examining. But right now, in this moment, it meant that Ron Baxter had looked through the glass door of a diner and seen Ezekiel Drummond and Tobias Osei eating breakfast. And decided without further inquiry that they required his attention. He reached down. He picked up the credential case with 2 fingers, holding it at its edge like he was handling something that might not be clean. He turned it over once, looked at the seal, looked at the name, and then he set it back down. "These can be printed," Baxter said. 3 seconds of silence followed that statement. 3 full seconds in which the only sound in the diner was rain against glass and the low hiss of something on the grill. Tobias Osei opened his jacket slowly, reached inside, and placed his own credentials on the table next to Ezekiel's. 2 cases, 2 federal seals, side by side. "Both of ours printed?" Tobias asked. His voice was mild, almost conversational. The mildness was not accidental. Baxter did not answer, as he turned instead toward the counter, where a 63-year-old man named Roosevelt Hicks stood at the pass-through window with a dish towel over his shoulder and both hands gripping the counter edge. Roosevelt had owned this diner for 23 years. He had seen arguments, medical emergencies, 1 marriage proposal, and a kitchen fire. He had never seen 2 federal agents walk in on a Thursday morning and do what these men were doing. "You," Baxter said, pointing at Roosevelt. "I need whatever surveillance system you've got running. All of it. Now." Roosevelt did not move. "You got paperwork for that?" "I got the authority." "Paperwork," Roosevelt said again. Same tone, same stillness. A man who had been waiting his whole adult life to say exactly that word to exactly this kind of person. Baxter's jaw tightened. He turned back to the booth. He pulled out his phone. He walked to the front window and read the license plate on the dark sedan parked at the curb outside, the vehicle Ezekiel and Tobias had arrived in, and he typed it into a search field. No probable cause, no consent, no legal basis at all. 4 violations in under 7 minutes, and the body camera clipped to his vest had been recording every one of them. What Baxter did not know, what neither he nor Merlot had any reason to suspect, was that 2 blocks away, in an unmarked vehicle with tinted windows, a federal agent named Carla Reyes was watching everything on a live feed. 3 monitors, 2 active recorders, a case file that had been building for 8 months and was, in this moment, writing its most important chapter on its own. Baxter returned to the booth, and he leaned in slightly. And then he said it. The thing that would follow him into a federal courtroom. The thing that would be printed on a placard and placed on an easel in front of 12 jurors. The thing spoken without hesitation, without lowering his voice, without any apparent awareness that the words were the most expensive he would ever say. Places like this, he said, sweeping one hand slowly around the diner. Need cleaning out, anyway. The room went silent. Not gradually. All at once. Ezekiel Drummond looked at Baxter for a long moment. Then he looked down at his chili bowl. He picked up his spoon, and he kept eating. Because Ezekiel Drummond had not come to this diner for breakfast. He had come here to do exactly what had just happened. And what had just happened was not the end of anything. It was Exhibit 7. What would you have done if you were sitting in that diner and watched all of this unfold right in front of you? Drop your answer in the comments, because the answer might surprise you once you find out who these 2 men really are. Baxter was still standing at the booth when the second agent, Craig Merlo, slid 2 steps closer to the aisle exit. It was a small movement. Most people in the diner didn't catch it. But Tobias Osei caught it immediately, because Tobias had been trained to read the geometry of rooms, who was blocking what, who was positioned where, what the physical arrangement of bodies in a space was designed to communicate. And what this arrangement communicated was, you are not leaving this booth without going through us. That was unlawful detention. Right there. No warrant, no arrest, no charge. To just 2 agents repositioning themselves around a table to prevent 2 men from moving freely. Tobias noted the time on his watch, 10:53 a.m. He would write it in his field report that evening with the same precision he applied to everything. Not because he was angry, but because precision was the language the law understood. Baxter leaned one hand on the table edge. Here's what I think is happening, he said, dropping his voice to the register people use when they want to sound reasonable while being the opposite. I think you 2 are in a situation you don't want to make worse. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to step outside. We're going to sort this out. And if everything checks out, he gestured vaguely at the credential cases still on the table. Then everybody goes home fine. Ezekiel looked up from his bowl. We're in the middle of eating. Baxter's expression shifted. The mask that had been performing patience slipped just slightly, the way masks do when they've been worn too long. Sir, Agent Baxter, Ezekiel said. Baxter stopped. Ezekiel had used his name. The name was on the identification card Baxter had flashed on the way in, visible for less than 2 seconds. Most people in that situation wouldn't have caught it. Ezekiel had caught it, filed it, and just deployed it, like a key turning a lock. A clear signal to anyone listening that the man in the green hoodie was not confused, not intimidated, and was cataloging every detail of this encounter with surgical attention. The diner held its breath. 3 phones were still elevated at various angles around the room. Nobody was hiding the fact that they were recording. Nobody was lowering their phones either. Baxter looked around at them. Something moved behind his eyes, a flicker of recalculation. Then he looked back at the table and picked up Tobias's credential case a second time, studying it more closely now. His thumb ran along the edge of the seal. This task force, out of Virginia? He asked. That's what it says, Tobias replied. Never heard of it. Most people haven't, Tobias said. That's the point. Another silence. This one felt different from the first. The first silence had been shock. This one was the particular quiet of a man beginning to understand that the ground under his feet was not as solid as he believed 30 seconds ago. Merlo, from his position near the aisle, cleared his throat. Baxter glanced at him. Something passed between them. Quick, wordless. And then Baxter straightened up. His posture changed. The lean-in was gone, replaced by a performance of authority rebuilt on shakier ground. We're going to need you to come with us, Baxter said. On what charge? Ezekiel asked. Obstruction of what? Tobias said. You haven't told us what operation you're running. You haven't produced a warrant. You've dismissed valid federal credentials, positioned yourself to block our exit, solicited surveillance footage without a subpoena, and run the plates on our vehicle without probable cause. He paused. I've been keeping count. That's 5 separate violations in 11 minutes, Would you like to add a sixth? The diner was so quiet that the rain outside, which had slowed to a steady drum against the awning, was the loudest thing in the room. Baxter did not answer immediately. He looked at Tobias the way a man looks at a chessboard when he realizes he's 3 moves from losing and the other player has been ahead of him the whole game. Then he said something that nobody expected. He almost smiled. "You're sharp," Baxter said, low, almost to himself. And then, like the words were an afterthought dressed up as authority, "Doesn't change anything." He turned to Roosevelt Hicks one more time. Last chance on that footage. Roosevelt looked at him for a long moment, then he looked past Baxter, directly at Ezekiel. Just for a half-second. A look that asked a question without words. Ezekiel gave the smallest nod. Not enough for Baxter to catch, but Roosevelt caught it. "No," Roosevelt said. Baxter held the counter's edge, released it, and stepped back. He exchanged another look with Merlot. Then he took out his phone. He moved to the front window again and made a call. His back was to the room. His voice was low enough that only fragments carried. Same area. Proceeding. Document it. Tobias watched Baxter's reflection in the fogged front window. The man's shoulders had tightened. Whatever confidence had walked through that door 20 minutes ago was now operating on a different fuel. Not certainty, but commitment. The kind that keeps people going even after they've made a mistake, because stopping now would mean admitting the mistake. That kind of commitment was dangerous. Tobias had seen it before. It was the kind that produced paperwork designed to rewrite what had actually happened. Reports that smoothed over what the body camera had recorded. Language carefully chosen to make an illegal stop look like standard procedure. The kind of paperwork. Tobias thought that was going to be very, very interesting to compare against the recording currently running in his watch. Baxter ended the call. He turned around. He looked at the booth one more time. 2 men, 2 bowls of chili, 2 federal badges on the table. And he made a decision that every version of him, on every day between now and the end of his career, would wish he hadn't made. He reached into his jacket, produced a small notepad, and began writing down the booth number. He was building a file. On 2 federal investigators, who were already building a file on him. Ask yourself this. At what point does arrogance stop being a personality trait and start being a confession? Because Ron Baxter just answered that question, and he doesn't even know it yet. Ezekiel Drummond had been in the diner since 7:45 in the morning. Not because he liked the chili, though he did, genuinely, in the way a man appreciates a thing more when he knows it might be taken away. He had been there because 3 weeks earlier, a document had landed on his desk in a 3rd-floor field office in Richmond, Virginia, and the document had a name highlighted in yellow. Roosevelt's Diner. Savannah, Georgia. 2 prior enforcement visits. No warrant either time. A civil forfeiture inquiry opened against the property within 90 days of each visit. Both inquiries closed without explanation. Legal fees incurred by the owner, $4,312. The diner was not an accident. It was a target. And what Ezekiel and Tobias were running, what they had been running for 8 months out of a joint federal-state task force that most people in their own agency had never heard of, was called Operation Meridian. Its purpose was specific. Document the systematic misuse of Federal Immigration Enforcement Authority as a mechanism for generating civil asset forfeiture revenue in minority-owned commercial corridors across the southeastern United States. In plain language, certain agents were walking into black-owned businesses, manufacturing compliance visits on paper, and then flagging those businesses for asset seizure proceedings. Not because any crime had been committed, but because the businesses had value, because the quarterly revenue numbers needed to climb, because nobody, until 8 months ago, who had been looking closely enough to catch it. Ezekiel was looking. He had been positioned in Savannah for 48 hours before Baxter walked through that door. The diner had been selected not just because of its history with the enforcement unit, but because of its visibility in the neighborhood. A known establishment, a recognized name, the kind of place that drew a steady community presence on weekday mornings. If Baxter's unit was going to make another move on a business in this zone, the probability matrix the task force had built over 8 months said it would happen here or within 2 blocks of here within the next 30 days. It happened on day 2. The entrance Baxter made was not coordinated through any official enforcement channel. The task force had monitored the county database, the regional operation logs, and the interagency communication system. Nothing had been filed. No operation had been registered. No warrant had been sought. Baxter and Merlot had simply walked in off the street on a rainy Thursday, looked through a window, and acted on something they called instinct, but the law called nothing, because the law does not recognize instinct as probable cause. What they had actually acted on, as 47 businesses across 4 states would eventually help prove, was a habit. 2 blocks away, Carla Reyes had watched the entire thing unfold in real time on a 3-screen display mounted in the back of a modified panel van. She was 34 years old, had spent 6 of those years in digital surveillance operations, and had the particular quality of stillness that came from spending most of her working hours in a dark space with very loud information. She had watched Baxter dismiss the credentials, watched Merlot block the aisle, watched Baxter run the plates on the task force vehicle, a move she documented with a timestamp before he'd even finished typing. When Baxter stepped outside to make his call, Carla had put on her headset and run the partial audio through the enhancement filter. The words were broken, but recoverable. Same area, proceeding, documented. She opened a new field in the case log and typed, "Subject contacted supervisor via personal device. Communication not through official channel. Timestamp 11:04 a.m." Then she kept watching. Inside the diner, Ezekiel had felt the precise moment the situation shifted from a potential intelligence opportunity into something more. It happened at the 11-minute mark, when Tobias recited the list of violations and Baxter did not deny a single one. A denial would have indicated confusion, or at least the performance of it. The absence of denial indicated something else. A man who knew what he was doing, had done it before, and had never once faced a consequence for it. That absence was its own kind of evidence. When Baxter returned to the booth after his call and began writing in his notepad, Tobias caught Ezekiel's eye across the table. The look lasted less than a second. It communicated 3 things simultaneously. He's building a false record, let him, and we've got everything we need. Ezekiel looked back at his chili bowl. He thought about the 47 businesses. He thought about the woman named Adeze Okonkwo, whose dry cleaning storefront account had been frozen for 4 months, whose 2 employees had left during that freeze, whose parking lot had been empty in a photograph taken on the day the freeze was lifted with no explanation and no apology. He thought about the memo written by a compliance officer who had flagged 3 falsified reports and was reassigned out of the department before anyone with authority acted on what he'd written. He thought about how long this had been happening before anyone looked. He thought about how it only stopped when someone did. Baxter closed his notepad, pocketed it, and nodded once at Merlot. They moved toward the door. Baxter pulled it open, let the rain air hit the room for a second, and then, half in and half out, turned back. He looked at the booth. He looked at Ezekiel specifically. "We'll be in touch," Baxter said. Ezekiel picked up his coffee mug, took a slow sip, just set it back down. "We know," he said. The door closed. The bell chimed. The diner exhaled. Roosevelt appeared from behind the counter and walked to the booth. He set a fresh coffee down without being asked. He looked at the 2 credential cases still on the table. He looked at the men who owned them. He didn't ask the question out loud, but it was written across every line of his face. Tobias answered it anyway. "You're not in any trouble," he said quietly, "but I'm going to need to ask you to hold on to that surveillance drive. Don't give it to anyone. Don't mention it. Can you do that?" Roosevelt was quiet for a long moment. The rain had picked up again outside. The grill hissed. Down the counter, a man in a work jacket was pretending to read his phone but hadn't turned the screen on. 23 years, Roosevelt said finally. "I built this thing 23 years. They've been in here twice before. Twice." He paused. "I know what they're doing." "I know you do," Tobias said. Roosevelt nodded. He picked up the empty coffee cups from the table, tucked them against his chest, and walked back toward the kitchen. At the pass-through window, he stopped, turned, and said one more thing without looking at them directly. "You eat free today." Tobias looked at Ezekiel. Ezekiel looked at the door where Baxter had just disappeared into the rain. Baxter had left believing he was building a case. He had no way of knowing that the case had been building against him for 8 months, that the diner was flagged, that the visit was watched, that the message he had just sent to his supervisor on a personal phone, the one that said same area, proceeding, it documented, would be subpoenaed, recovered, and entered into a federal record. And he had no way of knowing that somewhere in the message thread of that same personal phone, 11 days from now, there was going to be a text that would end careers the way a single match ends a dry field. But that was 11 days away. Right now, the rain was coming down, the coffee was hot, and two federal investigators sat in a red vinyl booth in Savannah, Georgia, and let the case keep writing itself. You already know something is wrong here. But do you know how deep it goes? Because what Baxter sent in that text message to his supervisor, and what his supervisor sent back, is the thing that changes every single thing about this story. There is a document that exists in the task force case file simply labeled Map 1. And it is not a map in the geographic sense. No roads, no landmarks, no coordinates drawn in ink. It is a spreadsheet printed on 4 pages of legal paper, taped together and pinned to the wall of the Richmond field office. 47 rows. Each row is a business. Each business has a name, a city, a date of first enforcement contact, a date of civil forfeiture inquiry, and a final column marked Outcome. 23 of those 47 rows have the word Proceedings in the Outcome column. 6 of those 23 rows have the word Settled. Ezekiel had stared at that document every morning for 8 months. He knew it the way a man knows a scar, not because he studied it, but because it was always there when he looked. The morning after the diner incident, he was back in Richmond. He stood in front of Map 1 with a fresh cup of coffee, and he looked at Roosevelt's diner. Row 31. 2 prior contacts, 2 inquiries. Both dropped. Owner, $4,000 in legal fees. Outcome column, survived. He added a new note in the margin. Active surveillance. 3rd contact attempt. November 14th. Agents. Baxter, R/Merlot, C, no warrant. Recording secured. Then he stepped back and looked at all 47 rows at once. The pattern was not complicated. It only looked complicated because the people running it had dressed it in the language of law. Community compliance check, discretionary enforcement contact, routine documentation review. These were phrases designed to sound procedural, to produce the appearance of legal basis where no legal basis existed. To strip the language away, and what remained was simple. Agents walked into minority-owned businesses, generated paperwork that made the visit look legitimate, and then flagged the business to a civil forfeiture review unit that opened asset proceedings without a crime ever being charged. The money did not go into anyone's personal account. That would have been easier to catch. The money went into the unit's operational budget, logged as recovered assets, counted toward quarterly revenue metrics, used to fund the very enforcement activities that were generating the revenue. The machine fed itself. Adaeze Okonkwo had been row 14 on the map. Her dry cleaning business on Abercorn Street had been visited on a Tuesday morning 18 months ago by 2 agents who were not Baxter and Merlot. Different agents, same unit, same playbook. They had arrived without a warrant, described the visit in their report as a community compliance check requested by a local official who, when contacted by Adaeze's attorney, had no record of making any such request. The civil forfeiture inquiry followed 88 days later. The account freeze came 11 days after that. 4 months. Her business account frozen for 4 months. The first employee left after month 2. She was a woman named Gloria Tate, who had worked the front counter for 11 years, who knew every regular by name, who remembered which customers took their shirts on hangers and which ones preferred folded. When Gloria called to say she had found something else, Adaeze had sat in the back of her shop for 20 minutes after hanging up and did not move. The second employee left at month 3. The business stayed open because Adaeze worked 18-hour days and refused to let it close, and because several of her customers, people who had watched what was happening to her, started coming in twice a week instead of once, spending more than they needed to, leaving tips they couldn't quite afford. The kind of community response that doesn't appear in any legal document, but was the only reason row 14 ended in the word survived. When the freeze was lifted, there was no letter, no explanation, no apology. The account simply became accessible again, the way a door that has been locked for months is one day found unlocked, and the person who locked it offers nothing, not a reason, not an acknowledgement, not even the dignity of eye contact. Adaeze had spent $4,900 in legal fees. No crime had ever been charged against her. No violation had ever been cited. No warrant had ever been issued. She had simply been on a list. a list no one was supposed to know existed. Inside the Richmond office, Ezekiel pulled up the internal communication logs for the enforcement unit, the official channel, the one that was monitored and archived and produced records visible to oversight bodies. He was looking for something specific. Any record of the Savannah Diner contact filed by Baxter on the day of the incident. There was nothing. Not a field report, not a contact log, not even a vehicle use entry for the geographic area. 11 miles of driving, a 20-minute enforcement contact with 2 federal officers, and an attempt to compel production of a private business's surveillance footage, and none of it existed in any official record. Off-book. That word had weight in federal investigations. Off-book meant the action was not sanctioned through the channels that created accountability. It meant the people running it knew it wouldn't survive scrutiny. It meant they had done this before, many times before, and had learned which actions to keep quiet and which to document, and had built an institutional muscle memory around the difference. Carla Reyes knocked twice on the office doorframe and walked in without waiting. She had a printout in her hand, the partial text recovery from Baxter's phone, the initial batch, the one that had come back from digital forensics at 3 that morning. She set it on the desk without ceremony. "See, message sent at 11:04, she said. "Personal device, to a number registered to a man named Dennis Pruitt. Regional Supervisor, GS15. Ezekiel read the message. Same area. Found another one. Proceeding to document. He looked at the timestamp. Looked at Carla. Found another one, he said. That's what it says. He set the printout down carefully, the way you set something down when you know it's going to matter for a very long time. Pull Pruitt's full record, he said. Personnel file, communication logs, everything tied to the forfeiture review unit going back 18 months. Carla was already writing it down. Ezekiel looked at map 1 again. All 47 rows. He thought about Adaeze Okonkwo pressing the button to unlock her own account after 4 months and discovering it worked again, like nothing had ever happened. He thought about Roosevelt Hicks, 63 years old, gripping the counter edge and saying one word: paperwork. The machine had been running for a long time. It had been running quietly, on paperwork designed to look clean from a distance, on the confidence of people who had never once been asked to explain themselves. Dennis Pruitt had never been asked. That was about to change. Here is the question you need to sit with before the next chapter. If a supervisor sends a text that says, "Found another one," and what does that tell you about how many times this has happened before? Because the answer is in the message thread. And the message thread is worse than you think. The body camera footage was 17 minutes and 43 seconds long. Ezekiel had watched it 11 times before he stopped counting. Not because he was looking for something new. The footage was clear, comprehensive, and damning in a way that required no interpretation, but because each viewing revealed a different layer. The first time he watched it, he saw the violations. The second time, he saw the sequence. By the 5th time, he was watching Baxter's hands. Baxter's hands told a story the rest of his body was trying not to tell. When he dismissed the credentials, his right hand opened and closed once at his side. A small, involuntary contraction, the kind a body makes when a person registers something unexpected and chooses not to show it. He had recognized the credentials, maybe not the specific task force, maybe not the exact issuing office, but he had recognized that they were real, and he had dismissed them anyway. That distinction, between not knowing and choosing not to acknowledge, was the difference between a mistake and a decision, between a training failure and a federal charge. The audio enhancement had been processed by the forensics team over 4 days. The lab worked in sections, cleaning each 30-second block of ambient sound before stitching the segments back together into a continuous transcript. What the raw recording had partially obscured, the counter-conversation between Baxter and Roosevelt, the exchange between Merlot and an off-camera diner patron who had moved toward the exit, 2 comments Baxter made under his breath between minute 9 and minute 11, came through clearly in the enhanced version. At minute 9, Baxter had said something to Merlot that the raw audio had captured only as a murmur, and the enhancement made it plain. Run the tags, full background. I want to know who these people are before we write this up. Write this up, before the stop had even concluded, before any finding, any charge, any legal basis for documentation. He was already composing the report in his head, and the report existed independently of what had actually happened, because the report was not going to describe what had actually happened. That was the infrastructure of the whole operation. Not the stops themselves, but the paperwork that followed them. Stops were opportunities. Paperwork was the product. The stops created the justification for the inquiries, and the inquiries generated the asset proceedings, and the proceedings generated the revenue, and the revenue validated the stops. A closed loop. He built on language carefully engineered to survive a surface-level audit while concealing what was underneath. Gerald Park had seen underneath. He had been a compliance officer in the unit for 7 years, and he had the specific misfortune of being good at his job. He had flagged 3 reports in a single memo. 3 reports that described enforcement contacts as cooperative when the body camera footage of those same contacts showed business owners asking agents to leave. He had documented the discrepancy. He had used precise language. He had addressed the memo to the regional supervisor and filed it through the official channel. The memo was received on a Tuesday, logged with a timestamp, assigned a file number under the category Routine Quality Review, pending. It sat in that category for 4 months, and then Gerald Park was transferred. The task force had spoken with Gerald Park 6 weeks before the Savannah operation. He had been cooperative, measured, and specific. He described the meeting with the supervisor that had followed his memo by 21 days, a meeting in which the supervisor had told him, in what Park described as a friendly tone, that he was a good officer and that not every report needed to be a dissertation. Park described how the word dissertation had sat with him for days afterward, not because of its tone, but because of its precision. A dissertation was a thing written to prove something to people who were already resistant to the conclusion. The supervisor had been telling him, without saying it directly, that the resistance was institutional, so that the conclusion Park had reached, that reports were being falsified, was one that the institution had no intention of accepting. Park had filed for transfer 28 days after that meeting. He told Ezekiel, "I didn't leave because I was scared. I left because I understood what the meeting meant. It meant the memo wasn't going anywhere, and neither was I, as long as I kept writing things that made the unit uncomfortable." Ezekiel had written that down verbatim. Now, 3 weeks after the Savannah Diner incident, he sat across from Carla Reyes in the Richmond office at 9 in the evening, and they laid out what they had: the body camera footage, the enhanced audio transcript, Roosevelt's surveillance recording, surrendered voluntarily and preserved under an evidence agreement, the partial text recovery from Baxter's personal device, 63% of the thread, enough for continuity, enough for meaning. The 8-month archive from Dennis Pruitt's phone, obtained under court order and currently being processed in segments by the forensics team. The statements from 6 business owners who settled forfeiture cases were tied to the same enforcement unit. Adeyeze Okonkwo's testimony, which she had given in 2 sessions with the quiet, devastating specificity of a woman who had memorized every number from the year her life was disrupted by people who had no right to disrupt it. The case had weight, real weight, the kind that sits in a room and changes the temperature. But there was something Ezekiel kept returning to. Something in the partial text recovery that hadn't been in the first analysis summary because it had come from the second batch of recovered messages, processed overnight and delivered to his desk at 6 that morning in a folder marked Supplement A. He opened the folder and slid it across the table to Carla. She read the recovered message. Her expression did not change. Carla Reyes had a face designed for this work. It registered information without broadcasting reaction. But her right hand, which had been resting on the edge of the table, went still. Completely still, in a way it hadn't been all evening. The message had been sent by Baxter to Pruitt at 9:14 on the Thursday evening of the Savannah incident. It read, "No one checks the small towns. Easy. 9 hours after dismissing 2 federal credentials in a diner. After a body camera had recorded 17 minutes of violations. After 3 civilian phones had recorded portions of the encounter from different angles. After the diner's surveillance system had captured the full approach and confrontation on 4 separate camera feeds. After a live surveillance feed had transmitted the entire incident to a task force vehicle 2 blocks away. 9 hours after all of that, Baxter had sent a message describing his day as easy. Carla set the folder down. She looked at Ezekiel. "He has no idea," she said. "None," Ezekiel said. She leaned back. "The Pruitt archive? The forensics team finishes processing the full 8 months when?" "Tomorrow morning," Ezekiel said. "Maybe sooner." Carla was quiet for a moment. Outside, Richmond at night was doing what it did, moving quietly, minding its business. At the city of government buildings and federal offices where paperwork became law and law became consequence. The lights in the building across the street were on in 2 offices on the 4th floor. "When we get the full archive," Carla said slowly, "what do you think we're going to find?" Ezekiel looked at the 47 rows of Map 1, still pinned to the wall. "I think," he said, "we're going to find out that Baxter was never the problem. He was just the face of it. The problem is, whoever taught him that places like that need cleaning out. Whoever told him that documentation follows action. Whoever put the number $280,000 next to Roosevelt's diner on a list before Roosevelt had ever done a single thing wrong." He paused. "The problem is Dennis Pruitt, and the problem goes back further than Pruitt." But Pruitt is where we start." Carla nodded once. She closed the folder. She picked up her coffee. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "Tomorrow morning," Ezekiel agreed. And somewhere across town, Dennis Pruitt was asleep. He had sent one message that evening to both of his field agents, a brief 7-word text, sent at 6:43 from the same personal phone he had been using for 8 months. To direct operations, he was careful to keep off every official record in existence. 7 words, sent before he went to sleep. The task force wouldn't retrieve it until morning. But when they did, it wouldn't read like the instruction of a man who believed he was being watched. It would read like the last move of a man who believed he was still safe. He wasn't. Pod, before the next chapter drops, what do you think was in that 7-word message from Pruitt? Leave your guess below, because the answer doesn't just expose one man. It opens a door that leads somewhere none of them expected. The 7-word message arrived at 6:43 in the morning. Carla Reyes read it at 7:11, standing in the Richmond field office still in her coat, coffee in one hand, the Supplement B printout in the other. She read it once, set the coffee down, read it again. The message from Dennis Pruitt to both Baxter and Merlot read, "Virginia is asking. Keep everything standard protocol. 7 words. Sent before sunrise. To 2 agents on personal devices. Through a channel that existed specifically because official channels created records and records created exposure. Virginia is asking." Pruitt knew. That he had known, at minimum, since the day after the Savannah incident that something was in motion. Known and not stopped. Known and sent that message anyway. Known and continued directing operations through the same unofficial channels, in the same minority-owned corridors, with the same paperwork engineered to hold up under surface review and collapse under anything deeper. Carla put the printout on Ezekiel's desk and walked to the wall where Map 1 hung. She stood there with her arms crossed and looked at it the way you look at something that has finally revealed its full shape after months of partial outlines. Ezekiel arrived at 7:22. He read the message in 3 seconds. He did not sit down. "Pull the full Pruitt archive," he said. "Everything forensics finished overnight." What the full archive revealed across the next 6 hours was not a smoking gun in the singular sense. It was an armory. The messages spanned 8 months of operational direction between Pruitt and 4 field agents, Baxter and Merlot, and 2 others named Curtis Waddle and Jerome Finch, operating in enforcement units across South Carolina and northern Florida. The archive ran to 1,143 individual messages. The forensics team had flagged 261 of them as operationally significant. Ezekiel read them in the order they were flagged. He took notes by hand on a legal pad, writing in a tight cursive that his colleagues had always found impossible to read, and that he had never bothered to make easier. The architecture of the scheme clarified itself message by message. Pruitt ran a bi-weekly review of what the messages called the Target Corridor Inventory, a rotating list of businesses in designated geographic zones that agents were instructed to contact on a rolling basis. The contacts were never described as asset targeting. They were described as compliance touchpoints, routine visibility, community presence maintenance. But every contact on the list was followed, in the messages, by an entry in a separate thread that Pruitt labeled budget stabilization. In that thread, the businesses were described by their estimated asset value, not their compliance status, not any criminal concern, their value. One message, sent by Pruitt to Waddle on a Wednesday afternoon in August, read, "Corridor 7 is underperforming. If focus on the Midland Strip. Estimated carry is 420. Get me documentation by end of month." 420 meant $420,000 in projected forfeiture proceeds. From businesses that had committed no crime, whose only exposure to the enforcement unit was that they existed in a zip code that Pruitt had designated as productive. Ezekiel circled that message on his legal pad. Then he drew a line from it to a note he had written 2 months earlier, when the task force had first mapped the connection between enforcement contacts and forfeiture proceedings. The correlation is not coincidental. Someone is directing it. That someone was Dennis Pruitt. And Pruitt did not operate alone. Message 612, sent on a Monday in October, was from Pruitt to an email address the task force had not previously encountered. The email address had a generic domain and a name string that resolved, after 2 days of digital tracing, to a deputy supervisor named Harlan Jeffcoat. GS14, 2 levels above Pruitt in the supervisory chain. The message read, Q, 3 numbers are strong. Board will ask about sustainability. I'll need the corridor reports formatted for standard presentation. Make sure the language is clean. Make sure the language is clean. Not accurate, not truthful. Clean. The language of a man managing a story, not documenting facts. Ezekiel set his legal pad down and looked out the window for a moment. Richmond in the morning was doing its ordinary thing. Traffic, buildings, to the gray November sky that had been sitting over the city for 2 weeks. Ordinary. The word felt heavy, because the thing about this, the thing that sat in his chest every time he read another message in this archive, was how ordinary it had all been to the people running it. How unremarkable. Message after message, written with the casual efficiency of people conducting routine business. No urgency. No concealment in the writing itself, only in the channel. They were not afraid of what they were doing. They had never once been given a reason to be. Until now. Carla appeared in the doorway. She held a second printout, the forensic reconstruction of a deleted thread from Baxter's phone, the one he had wiped on the evening of the Savannah incident. The recovery wasn't complete, but what survived was enough. See, message 44 in the recovered batch, Carla said, sent by Baxter to Pruitt, 4 days after Savannah. She read it aloud. Those 2 at the diner. I looked them up after. Task force out of Richmond, federal. You said Virginia was asking, how long have they been watching us? She looked up. Pruitt's response was deleted. Not recovered, but we've got Baxter's follow-up message, sent 40 minutes later. She read, understood, keeping it standard. Nobody checks the paperwork twice, if the numbers look right. Nobody checks the paperwork twice. Ezekiel was quiet for a long moment. File the grand jury application, he said. Carla nodded once. She was already writing. The case had just expanded from field-level misconduct into documented supervisory conspiracy involving at minimum 6 individuals across 2 states, each with paper trails pointing toward a 7th. The grand jury proceedings would be sealed. The subpoenas would be served quietly. The agents would not know what was coming until it arrived at their doors. But that was not the thing Ezekiel was thinking about as Carla walked back to her desk. He was thinking about message 44, about Baxter 4 days after Savannah, finally understanding that the 2 men in the booth had been watching him, about the anxiety in the phrasing. How long have they been watching us? The first real crack in the armor of a man who had operated for years in the belief that confidence was the same thing as protection. 8 months? The answer was 8 months. And Baxter would find that out, not in a message, but in a courtroom. And when a prosecutor stood up and walked a jury through every week of those 8 months, one documented action at a time. He just didn't know that yet. And here is what you need to understand going into the next chapter. Pruitt's response to Baxter was deleted. Gone. But that deletion, that single act of wiping one message, is going to become its own charge. Because in a federal investigation, destroying evidence after you know you're being watched isn't cleanup. It's confirmation. The grand jury met on a Tuesday. Nobody announced it. That was the whole point. The subpoenas had been served over a span of 4 days, not through official department channels, not through the enforcement unit's administrative office, but hand-delivered to home addresses in the early morning hours before the workday started. The witnesses who received them included Roosevelt Hicks, Adaeze Okonkwo, Gerald Park, and 3 of the 6 business owners whose settled forfeiture cases were tied to the same enforcement unit. Each subpoena was accompanied by a federal instruction not to discuss the summons with anyone. None of them violated that instruction. The supervisory personnel, Pruitt, Jeffcoat, and 2 unit managers, were interviewed separately on the same Wednesday, at different locations, starting at staggered times so that none of them crossed paths or had the chance to coordinate. Each interview was conducted by a different pair of investigators. Each interview was recorded. Each was transcribed by a court reporter whose work product entered the sealed record before the end of the business day. The inconsistencies appeared within the first hour. Pruitt was interviewed at 9 in the morning in a federal building in Atlanta. He arrived in a dark suit and a blue tie, sat down without being asked, and placed both hands flat on the table in a posture that communicated very deliberately that he was a man with nothing to conceal. He answered the first 7 questions with the precision of someone who had been preparing. His language was measured, his pauses were calculated. He was performing composure, and he was doing it well. Then the investigator opened a folder and placed a single document on the table. It was a printout of one message. Message number 612, sent by Pruitt to Harlan Jeffcoat. The one that read, Q, 3 numbers are strong. Board will ask about sustainability. I'll need the corridor reports formatted for standard presentation. But make sure the language is clean. Pruitt looked at it. His hands, which had been flat and still on the table since he sat down, shifted. Not dramatically, just slightly. The left one moved 2 inches toward the edge of the table and then stopped, as if he had noticed himself moving and corrected it. That's a routine communication about quarterly reporting, Pruitt said. Which corridor reports? The investigator asked. A pause. The standard unit activity reports. The ones that describe businesses by their estimated asset value? Another pause, longer this time. Our reports use standard documentation fields. The investigator placed a second document on the table. The budget stabilization thread. 12 entries. Business names, geographic coordinates, and projected forfeiture amounts. Pruitt looked at it for 3 full seconds without speaking. I'd need to consult with my attorney before responding to that, he said. That's your right, the investigator said, and noted the time, 9:41. 32 minutes into the interview. The first invocation of counsel came at the first document tied directly to the targeting methodology. Jeffcoat, interviewed simultaneously in a federal building in Charlotte, answered his first 14 questions with a consistency that suggested he had rehearsed. He described the corridor reports as compliance metrics. He described the Q3 message as routine oversight communication. He described having no knowledge of the specific language used in field agents' operational discussions. I am on the 15th question. When the investigator asked about message 612 specifically, producing a copy with Jeffcoat's own email address visible in the recipient field, Jeffcoat's rehearsed rhythm broke. He asked to see the document again. He read it twice. And then he said something that the court reporter captured with exact fidelity. I receive a large volume of communications. I may not have reviewed this one in detail. The investigator looked at him. Your email address is in the recipient field, sir, and there's a read receipt timestamp. Jeffcoat asked for his attorney 11 minutes later. Back in Richmond, Ezekiel received the field reports from both Atlanta and Charlotte within 2 hours of the interviews concluding. He read the Pruitt summary first, then the Jeffcoat summary, then placed them side by side on his desk. The inconsistency he had expected to find between their accounts and the documentary record was there. But there was a secondary inconsistency he hadn't anticipated. The 2 men's accounts of the Savannah incident contradicted each other directly. Pruitt had described the Savannah contact as an unsanctioned field decision made by Baxter without supervisory direction. Jeffcoat had described it as a routine regional operation consistent with standard unit activity. One said it was rogue. One said it was normal. They had not coordinated. In separate rooms, on the same day, they had given answers that could not both be true, and either answer, in the context of the documentary record, created a problem they could not talk their way out of. Gerald Park's testimony lasted 3 hours and 12 minutes. He arrived early. He brought no attorney. He answered every question in a direct, methodical sequence that reflected the same precision he had applied to the memo that had gotten him pushed out of the unit 14 months earlier. He named names. He cited dates. He described specific conversations with specific people in specific rooms. When he finished, the lead prosecutor in the room looked at the court reporter and then back at Gerald Park and said, "Do you understand that your testimony today may be used in a federal proceeding?" Park said, "That's why I came." The grand jury returned its finding on a Thursday afternoon. The sealed indictment named 6 individuals: Baxter, Merlo, Waddell, Finch, Pruitt, and Jeffcoat. The charges ranged from civil rights violations under color of law to conspiracy to falsify enforcement documentation to obstruction specifically for the deleted messages, the buried memo, and the forced transfer of Gerald Park. Ezekiel received the confirmation call at 4:17. He was standing in the parking lot of the field office because he had needed air. He stood there for a moment after the call ended. November, in Richmond. The trees had gone bare, and the sky was the flat gray of late afternoon. Somewhere across the city, 6 people were going about their evening with no knowledge that a sealed document now existed with their names on it. He put his phone in his pocket and went back inside. There was still work to do. The indictment was sealed. The arrests had not yet happened. And one motion, one small, yet quiet motion that Ezekiel had filed separately from the main indictment 3 days earlier, was still pending before a federal judge. He had not told anyone what was in it yet. Not Carla. Not the lead prosecutor. Not the task force director. The judge would rule on it in the morning. The question is this: why would a federal investigator file a separate, quiet motion in the middle of a case that was already sealed and moving forward? What was in it that couldn't wait? And couldn't be part of the main indictment? That answer lands in the next chapter, and it changes the shape of the whole story. The arrests began at 6 in the morning on a Wednesday and were over by 6:52. 6 doors, 6 federal teams, all moving simultaneously across 3 states, a time to the minute so that no arrest could be communicated to any other subject before the handcuffs were on. The coordination had taken 11 days to plan. Each team had a specific window: enter, confirm identity, serve the warrant, secure, and each team hit its window clean. Baxter opened his front door in Savannah, still half asleep, wearing a gray shirt and boxers, and stood on his front step, looking at the 4 federal agents on his porch the way a man looks at something his brain keeps refusing to process as real. He asked no questions. He said only one thing, quietly, to no one in particular: the diner. Not a question. A recognition. A man arriving, 9 weeks late, at the understanding that the 2 men in the red vinyl booth had not been what he thought they were. Merlot went quietly, and he sat on the edge of his bed and put his shoes on and said nothing at all. Curtis Waddell, the agent operating out of South Carolina, was the only one who offered resistance. Not physical resistance. He was smart enough for that. Verbal resistance. He stood in his kitchen doorway and told the lead agent that his attorney would have this dismissed by noon, that the whole thing was a political operation against good officers doing hard work, that the people responsible for this would answer for it. The lead agent waited for him to finish. Then she said, "Sir, we have a sealed federal indictment. Please put on your shoes." He put on his shoes. Dennis Pruitt was already awake when the team arrived. His wife later told investigators that he had been awake since 4, had gotten up, made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table and not moved for 2 hours. When the knock came, he walked to the door himself. His wife stood in the hallway behind him. She was holding the sleeve of her robe closed at her throat, watching. Pruitt looked at the warrant. He looked at the lead agent. And then he looked back at his wife, and the look on his face, which a federal agent standing 6 feet away described in her field report as something between resignation and relief, was the look of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had just put it down because he had no more choice. "I'll call you from processing," he told his wife. She nodded. She did not say anything. Harlan Jeffcoat did not answer his door on the first knock, or the second. On the third, louder. And with the formal announcement of federal warrant service, the door opened. He was fully dressed. Pressed shirt, dark pants, shoes already on. He had prepared. He handed the lead agent a business card, his attorney's contact information. He said, "Every communication will go through him." Then he stepped outside and walked to the vehicle without being directed. All 6 were processed by midday at a federal holding facility outside Richmond. Photographed, fingerprinted, booked under charges that, when the indictment was formally unsealed at 2 in the afternoon, were read into the public record by a federal court clerk whose voice carried the particular flatness of a person who reads serious things into official records every day and has learned not to editorialize. At 2:11, a wire service released a 4-paragraph bulletin. And federal agents and supervisors arrested in multi-state civil rights and asset forfeiture investigation. 6 individuals. Charges include conspiracy, civil rights violations under color of law, falsification of federal documentation, and obstruction. Additional details in court filing. At 2:14, a news alert pushed to phones across Savannah, Georgia. Roosevelt Hicks was in his kitchen at the time, running the lunch service down to its final 30 minutes. His granddaughter, Shayla, walked to the pass-through window and held up her phone without saying anything. Roosevelt read the alert. He read it again. He handed the phone back through the window. He said, "Finish the beans," and he went back to the stove. He finished the service. He cleaned the kitchen. He locked the back door. He turned off the grill. As he sent Shayla home, and he sat down in the booth in the back, the red vinyl booth, the one where Ezekiel and Tobias had been sitting 9 weeks earlier. And he sat there with the lights low and the rain tapping the front windows, because November in Savannah never really left the rain behind, and he let himself feel exactly what he felt. He had known the morning those agents walked in that something was going to happen because of it. He had felt it the way you feel weather before it arrives. Not a certainty, but a direction. He had kept the surveillance drive. He had called the number. He had done what the situation asked him to do, which was the same thing he had been doing for 23 years. Show up, do the work, protect the place. The place was still standing. Suridaezi Okonkwo heard about the arrests from a customer who came in for a pickup at 3 in the afternoon and mentioned it in passing. The way people mention things they don't know are personally significant to the person they're mentioning them to. Adaizi thanked the customer, finished the transaction, and stood at the counter for a moment after the door closed. Then she picked up the phone and called her attorney. Not for legal reasons. Just because her attorney was the person who had been with her through the 4 months of the account freeze, who had filed the motions and made the calls and sat across from her in his office and said, more than once, "We are going to make sure this is documented." She wanted him to know before he heard it from a news alert. He answered on the second ring. She said, "They arrested them." A pause. And then he said, "All of them?" "6?" she said. Another pause. Longer. "Good," he said. Just that word. But in the way he said it, there were 4 months of legal fees and 1 missing employee and a parking lot full of empty spaces, and every morning Adaizi had unlocked her door and refused to let the building sit dark. Now, about that separate motion Ezekiel had filed quietly, 3 days before the indictment was unsealed. The judge had ruled on it at 8:45 that morning, before the arrests, before the unsealing, before any of the public record existed. The ruling had been entered into a separate docket. It would not become part of the public case file for another 2 weeks. It was a motion to expand the civil audit, not just of this unit, of the entire Regional Enforcement Division. See all forfeiture proceedings initiated in the prior 24 months. All documentation. All contact logs. All budget stabilization communications that could be tied to official operations through any channel, official or personal. The judge had granted it. Ezekiel had not filed that motion because he believed the 6 arrested individuals were the outer limit of the problem. He had filed it because message 612, the one to Jeffcoat that said, "Make sure the language is clean," had come with a CC line, a blind CC recovered in the metadata of the email header rather than the visible recipient field. The CC was an address the task force had traced to a federal budget oversight office 3 levels above Jeffcoat in the chain, 3 levels above. It which meant the quarterly reports with the clean language had been going somewhere higher than a deputy supervisor, which meant someone above Jeffcoat had been reading them, and had not asked a single question about the corridor estimates, or the budget stabilization numbers, or the 47 businesses listed by asset value without a single criminal charge. The question was, did they know? Or had the language been clean enough that they never had to? That question was going to take longer to answer than an indictment. It was going to take the full civil audit. 90 days, minimum. The arrests were the visible result. The audit was the deeper one. And the deeper one was just getting started. If this story has made you feel something, anger, relief, disbelief, or all 3 at once, you are not alone. I'd leave a comment below and tell us what you're thinking right now. Because the final chapters are where all of it comes together, and where justice stops being a concept and becomes a consequence. The trial began on a Monday morning in a federal courthouse in Richmond, Virginia, and the first thing the jury saw was not a person. It was a map. Elaine Carver, lead prosecutor, 12 years in the Civil Rights Division, a woman whose courtroom presence was built entirely on stillness and precision, had the map projected on a screen before the first juror sat down. It was Map 1, all 47 rows, 47 businesses listed by name and city, 47 civil forfeiture inquiries initiated without a single criminal charge filed against any of them. She let the jury read it for 60 seconds without speaking, and then she said, "The government is going to prove that every business on this list was treated not as a community, not as a legal matter, not as a public safety concern, but as a number, a dollar amount, a line in a budget." She paused. "We are going to prove that the people responsible for that knew exactly what they were doing, and that they built a system around it designed to look like law." The defense opened with confusion. That was the strategy. Not innocence, but complexity. The argument that the task force had taken isolated actions and constructed a pattern retroactively. That the budget stabilization language was internal shorthand misread by investigators unfamiliar with unit culture. That the credential dismissal in Savannah had been a genuine field judgment made under ambiguous circumstances. The defense attorney, see, a polished man named Wallace Okafor, who had spent 20 years doing exactly this kind of work, was skilled. He used the complexity of the interagency landscape as a fog machine, introducing enough procedural nuance that individual jurors might find individual moments defensible. Elaine Carver let him build the fog. Then she began, methodically, to clear it. She called Gerald Park first. Park took the stand in a charcoal suit, hands folded in his lap, and answered every question in the same measured cadence he had used in his grand jury testimony. He described the 3 falsified reports. He described the memo. He described the Tuesday meeting with Pruitt, and the word dissertation, and the 28 days he spent afterward deciding whether to fight an institution that had already decided not to fight for what was right. See, Wallace Okafor cross-examined him for 2 hours. He questioned Park's memory, his motivations, his decision to leave the unit rather than escalate his concerns through additional channels. He suggested that a man who truly believed misconduct was occurring would have gone to the Inspector General, not quietly requested a transfer. Park waited for the question to finish. Then he said, "I went to my direct supervisor. That's the official first step. He told me to drop it. When the official channel tells you the door is closed, going through the next door up requires evidence. I had the memo. I didn't have the archive. You do. You're welcome to explain why you think I should have been able to get it alone." Okafor moved on. Adaize Okonkwo testified on the 3rd day of trial. She wore a navy dress and carried a manila folder of receipts she had never been asked to produce, but had brought because she wanted every number she cited to be verifiable. She described the freeze. She described Gloria Tate leaving. She described 18-hour workdays and the particular silence of a business that is technically open but operating at a fraction of its capacity, because the community doesn't yet know whether it's safe to come back. When Elaine Carver asked her what she wanted the jury to understand, Adaize looked at the jury directly and said, "I want them to understand that I did not fight this because I thought I would win. I fought it because my grandmother worked in a laundry for 40 years so that I could own mine. Nobody was going to take it. Not without a full fight." The courtroom was quiet after that, in a way that is different from ordinary quiet. It was the quiet of a room that has just heard something it is going to remember. The body camera footage was introduced on day 5, all 17 minutes and 43 seconds. The jury watched it in full. They watched Baxter approach the booth. They watched the credential dismissal. They watched Merlot position himself at the aisle exit. They watched Baxter pressure Roosevelt Hicks at the counter. They watched the plate run. And then, at minute 17, they heard it. Places like this need cleaning out anyway. Elaine Carver did not comment on the statement after it played. She simply let it exist in the air of the courtroom for 7 full seconds. So then she said, "The government moves to the text archive." The text archive came in through a digital forensics expert named Dr. Laverne Mosley, who had spent 11 years authenticating electronic evidence in federal proceedings, and who walked the jury through the recovery methodology with the patience of a teacher who has explained a complex thing to non-specialists many times, and has learned exactly where people need the most help. She explained chain of custody. She explained the metadata authentication process. She explained why the deleted messages, even partially recovered, were admissible and reliable. Then Elaine Carver took over and read the messages herself. Not projected on a screen, read aloud. Her voice was flat and even, which made them land harder than emphasis would have. And the message about Corridor 7 and the 420 estimate. The budget stabilization thread. The message that said documentation follows action. The message that said nobody checks the paperwork twice if the numbers look right. And the one that said no one checks the small towns. Each message landed in the courtroom like a stone dropped in still water. The ripple was visible in the jury box. Small shifts, eyes moving from the screen to the defendants, expressions doing the work that expressions do when they are processing not just information, but the moral weight of it. The pattern evidence was admitted over defense objection on day 7. 47 businesses, 18 months. The statistical correlation presented by forensic economist Dr. To Reginald Achebe, whose credentials took 12 minutes to read into the record, placed the probability of the enforcement to forfeiture pattern occurring by chance at less than 0.5%. Wallace Okafor challenged the methodology. Dr. Achebe walked through it again, slower, with the quiet confidence of a man who has been challenged on his methodology before and has never lost the argument. On the final day of testimony, Elaine Carver stood and delivered a closing that lasted 41 minutes and used no emotional language. No appeals, no rhetoric. She walked the jury through the evidence the way you walk someone through a house you know completely. Room by room, door by door. Nothing hidden. Nothing theatrical. The defendants did not make mistakes, she said near the end. Mistakes look different from this. Your mistakes are isolated. Mistakes are corrected when someone points them out. Mistakes don't generate budget projections. Mistakes don't have target corridors. Mistakes don't require language to be kept clean. She paused. What you have seen in this courtroom is a system, built by these individuals, maintained by these individuals, profitable for these individuals, and devastating for 47 businesses and the communities around them who had done nothing except exist in the wrong zip code, at the wrong time, with assets worth taking. She returned to her seat. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 19 minutes. The foreperson was a woman named Celestine Moreau, retired schoolteacher, 61 years old, who had sat in the second seat of the first row for the entire trial and taken notes in a wire-bound notebook with a precision that several jurors would later describe as the thing that kept their deliberations grounded. When she stood to deliver the verdict, she held the verdict form with both hands and read each count in a clear, level voice that matched, in its steadiness, everything Elaine Carver had built over 11 days of trial. Guilty on the primary charges, on multiple counts, for every defendant. Baxter, hearing the word, closed his eyes for 2 seconds, then opened them. Pruitt looked at the table in front of him. Jeffcoat looked at his attorney. In the gallery, Ezekiel Drummond sat beside Tobias Osei and Carla Reyes, and did not move. He looked at the floor for a moment. And then he took a slow breath and looked up at the courtroom ceiling, which was high and white, and said nothing at all, the way ceilings in courtrooms always do, as if the room itself is leaving the weight of the moment entirely to the people inside it, which is exactly where it belongs. Tell us in the comments, when that word guilty was read out, what did you feel? Because justice in a courtroom sounds quieter than most people expect. And what happens at sentencing sounds even quieter. But it lands harder than anything that came before it. Sentencing day was gray and cold. The kind of cold that Richmond gets in February, not dramatic, not violent, just steady and committed, the way certain facts are steady and committed once they have been written into a federal record and signed by a judge. The defendants arrived in separate vehicles through the courthouse's side entrance, accompanied by their attorneys. No cameras inside, no audience in the gallery beyond family members and task force personnel, and a single court sketch artist positioned near the left wall, whose charcoal pencil moved continuously throughout the morning. The judge was the Honorable Daphne Whitmore Cross, 29 years on the federal bench. She was a woman who had sentenced people at every level of the justice system, people who had made terrible decisions in desperate circumstances, and people who had made calculated decisions in comfortable ones, and she understood the difference in the way that only a person who has seen thousands of individual cases understands it, not as a theory, but as a texture. Udale weight the room carried differently depending on which kind it was. This was the second kind. She addressed each defendant individually before pronouncing sentence. She did not perform outrage. She did not lecture. She spoke in the measured, precise language of a judge who believed that the weight of a moment should be carried by the facts themselves, not by the voice delivering them. To Baxter, she said, "You made a decision at that booth." Not once, repeatedly, Over the course of 20 minutes, you made decisions that you knew were wrong. You dismissed credentials you recognized. You ran a plate without cause. You made a statement that expressed, with complete clarity, your view of the people and places in your enforcement zone. And then, 9 weeks later, you deleted a message thread that you understood could be used against you. Now, that is not a series of errors. That is a series of choices. Baxter received 63 months on the primary federal charges, with supervised release to follow. Merlot received 48 months. Waddell and Finch, whose involvement spanned a wider geographic corridor and a longer documented period, received 71 and 68 months respectively. Pruitt stood at the defense table for his sentencing and looked, for the first time in the entire trial, like a man who had run out of the internal architecture that had sustained him. The posture that had walked into the Atlanta interview room in a dark suit with both hands flat on the table was gone. What remained was a man in his late 50s who had spent 22 years in federal law enforcement and would now spend a significant portion of what came next answering for what he had done with that authority. Judge Whitmore Cross looked at him for a long moment before she spoke. "You directed this operation," she said. "You assigned the corridors. You set the budget targets. You wrote the message that told your agents that documentation follows action. And when a compliance officer in your own unit had the integrity to put the truth on paper, you spent 3 weeks deciding how to remove him from the room where that truth could cause you problems." She paused. The compliance officer kept his integrity. You are here. He is not. Pruitt received 96 months, 8 years. Plus obstruction charges layered on top that added another 18 months in supervised release and a permanent bar from any position in federal law enforcement. Jeffcoat, whose involvement had been documented at the CC line level of the email chain rather than in the direct operational messages, received 42 months. His attorney argued for leniency on the basis of indirect involvement. Judge Whitmore Cross acknowledged the distinction and reduced the count structure accordingly, and then noted that receiving a quarterly report designed to make illegal activity look clean, reading it, and asking no questions about the corridor estimates or the business names or the projected forfeiture figures was a choice. The choice of a person who understood what was happening and decided that the numbers looked good enough not to disturb. So ignorance, Judge Whitmore Cross said, requires not reading your own email. The courtroom absorbed that in silence. After sentencing, the consequences moved outward, the way they always do when the immediate legal event is the center, and the ripples are the part that takes longer to see. The Regional Enforcement Division was placed under an 18-month federal oversight arrangement. All civil forfeiture proceedings initiated in the prior 24 months were subject to the expanded audit Ezekiel had filed for. 51 cases were reviewed. 29 of them were found to lack adequate legal basis. Restitution proceedings were opened on all 29. The mandatory operational reforms went into effect within 60 days of sentencing. Warrant documentation required for all business entry. Body camera activation, mandatory from initial approach. Civil forfeiture proceedings tied directly to filed criminal charges only. No more pre-charge inquiries, no more asset profiling of businesses that had done nothing wrong. An independent oversight unit was established specifically to audit forfeiture documentation on a rolling quarterly basis. It was staffed by people who had no prior connection to the Enforcement Division and was funded, in a structural decision that Ezekiel had quietly advocated for from the beginning, by reallocating a portion of future forfeiture revenue, turning the mechanism that had been used to harm communities into the mechanism responsible for making sure it never happened again. Adaize Okonkwo received a restitution notice on a Friday afternoon in April. The letter was formal and brief, which is how legal documents tend to be, and it outlined the terms of the recovery proceeding and the estimated timeline for resolution. She read it at her counter. She folded it into thirds. She put it in the drawer beneath the register. She thought about the $4,900 in legal fees. She thought about Gloria Tate, who had since found work across town and who had stopped in twice in the past 3 months. Not to ask about coming back, just to check on the place, just to look. The second time, Adaize had given her a hug that lasted longer than either of them had planned for, which is the way certain things get said that cannot be said in words. She thought about her grandmother, about 40 years of laundering other people's clothes so that one day someone in the family could own the building. Or she opened the drawer and put the letter in it, and closed it, and helped the next customer. Roosevelt Hicks kept his diner. More than kept it. The Thursday morning crowd had grown. Word had moved through the neighborhood the way word moves through places that have been tested and held. And people who had never been inside came in, sat down, ordered bowls of chili, and stayed longer than they expected. The parking lot filled early. The swivel stools at the counter were taken by 8:15 most mornings. He reupholstered the red vinyl booth in the back. Same color, same style. He didn't make a ceremony of it. He just came in one morning, and it was done. Shayla, his granddaughter, asked him why he had kept the same color. He said, "Because it didn't do anything wrong." Ezekiel Drummond drove to Savannah on a Thursday in March. Not on assignment. The Meridian case was closed, the file archived, the task force dissolved back into its component agencies. He drove because he had been in that city for 48 hours on the most consequential operation of his career and had never once walked around it. He parked near Forsyth Park and walked for an hour. The squares were quiet in the March morning, the Spanish moss still and pale in the cold air, the old buildings doing what old buildings in Savannah do, standing in a way that feels less like architecture and more like memory. Then he drove to the diner. Roosevelt was in the kitchen. Shayla was taking orders. Tobias was already there, seated in the red vinyl booth in the back, denim jacket, collar up, a bowl of chili in front of him that he had apparently been waiting on before starting. Ezekiel slid into the seat across from him. Roosevelt appeared at the pass-through window, saw them both, and disappeared back into the kitchen without a word. 2 bowls arrived within minutes. They ate. The rain came in off the river the way it does in March. Not the sideways November kind, but something lighter, almost gentle. The diner filled steadily. The bell above the door chimed every few minutes. People came in wet and sat down, and the room did what rooms do when they are working the way they were built to work. Near the end of the meal, Roosevelt came out of the kitchen and pulled a chair to the end of the booth. Not inside it, just at the edge, the way a man sits when he has something to say, and isn't sure whether he's staying. He looked at both of them for a moment. "You know what the worst part was?" he said. "Not the fees. Not the agents coming in. The worst part was not knowing if anybody was paying attention." He paused. "That's the thing that eats at you. Not the bad thing itself. The idea that the bad thing is just going to keep happening, and nobody is counting." Ezekiel looked at him. "We were counting," he said. Roosevelt nodded. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he stood up, straightened his apron, and said, "You eat free. Both of you. Every time." He went back to the kitchen. Ezekiel and Tobias sat in the booth and finished their chili and listened to the rain and the bell above the door and the low hum of the room going about its ordinary life, which is what ordinary life does. It continues, it shows up, it keeps the lights on and the grill running and the door unlocked for whoever needs to come in from the cold. The prosecutor filed one final motion on the last business day of the quarter. Administrative closure. Case reference sealed. 1 paragraph, 2 signatures, 1 judge. Justice does not roar. It doesn't need to. It files and stamps and enters into record. And on a rainy Thursday morning in Savannah, Georgia, 2 men in a red vinyl booth ate their chili slowly and let arrogance walk into its own consequences. They were counting. Every single time. And so was the law. That is the end of Wrong Table. Every chapter of this story, every booth, every badge, every deleted message, every business that survived, was built on the truth that accountability, no matter how long it takes, finds its way to the right door. If this story moved you, if it made you angry, or if it reminded you that the people who show up and refuse to be moved are always the most important people in the room, share it. Right now. Put it in front of someone who needs to hear it. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell us which moment hit you the hardest. Tell us about someone you know who held on the way Roosevelt did, the way Adizi did, the way Gerald Park did when he filed that memo knowing full well the institution didn't want to read it. Those stories matter. And this channel exists to tell them. Subscribe right now and turn on notifications. Every week we bring you stories built on real stakes. Stories about ordinary people who faced systems that weren't built for them and held their ground anyway. You do not want to miss what comes next. The next story is already being built. See, and it starts the same way this one did, with a moment that looks small, in a place that looks ordinary, and a truth that was always there, waiting for someone to be counting. We'll see you in the next one.